In this video, we will dive deep into the implementation details of two directives we learned in the previous video, namely form group and form control name. This video is optional, so you can safely skip it, but if you like to know what processes happen under the hood, then continue to watch it. Let's get started with the form control name directive and find it in the source code of Angular Forms. So I jump to the array of reactive-driven directives, and here's the form control name directive. Cool. As you can see, it is just a regular Angular directive that has an appropriate selector that we use in our form right here. I will not be explaining all code here, but we will have a look at the main key points in its lifecycle. So everything starts with the constructor when a directive instance is being created. Here you can see that it injected some batch of stuff via dependency injection. Some of them I will skip for now because ng validators and ng async validators we will cover later in this course. The same for ng value accessor, and this last injection is kind of legacy stuff that we will not be touching at all. Let's focus on the very first line in the constructor. It injects some parent that is some control container. But what is that? Well, control container is a base class for the form group directive that we actually use in our form, and also it is a base class for the form group name and form array name directives that we'll cover in the next videos. So it can be one of those directives. Also, you can see that the parent property is optional. The control should come from some parent injector, so the skip self resolution modifier is used, and the resolution should be restricted by the view of the component where this directive is used, because if the provider for it wasn't found within this view, then it is the wrong usage of the directive and it doesn't make sense to traverse the injector tree further. And this is actually the reason why it is annotated with host resolution modifier. So basically, the form control name directive tries to find the closest directive that extends control container class, skipping the check in its own injector, and in such a way, the first directive that extends control container will be our form group. This directive is declared within the same view as form control name, so this form group will be eventually resolved as the parent for this directive instance. Okay, sorry that I spent some time on it, but very often resolution modifiers confuse developers, so I decided to invest some time explaining it. But let's move forward. After the constructor happens resolution of input bindings, and the string we provide in the template right here will be resolved in this input. And what happens every time when the input binding changes? Right, the ng-on-changes lifecycle hook is triggered. Here happens setting up the control if it is not added yet, and some legacy deprecated things that I will skip. So let's jump into the setup control method. Here it checks the parent type. Basically it says that the parent can be only one of the following directives, and if it's not, then you will get runtime errors. Then form control name directive calls the add control method of our form directive, which is, in our case, if you remember, the instance of the form group directive, and it provides itself as an argument for that method. The result of this method will be an instance of the form control that matches the key we provided as a value to this directive. In my case, I provide the first name string, so from the form group will be resolved exactly this form control instance. And then this instance will be assigned to the control property of this directive class, and it will be marked as it is added. So this is how looks the initialization process of the directive. When the directive is being destroyed, then the opposite thing happens. The control is being removed from the form. So this is the life cycle of this directive. Now let's do the same for the form group directive. As you can see, it is also just a simple Angular directive with the appropriate selector. It also has a constructor where validators are being injected and configured. It also has an input where we provide the form model we built in our component class, and we provide it as a value for this directive. Again, when input binding changes, the ng-on-changes hook is called. Here basically happens resetting of validators, values, etc. because the new form arrives and all those stuff needs to be recalculated. I wouldn't say that there happens anything that we have to pay special attention to. So let's move forward, and better, let's find the add control method that we called in the form control name directive. Here, as you remember, we provide the form control name directive instance, and it has some property path that is used to fetch an appropriate control from the form group instance. It looks like we missed path property, isn't it? Well, the path is actually an array of strings that contains the path to the form control in the form group and consists of its own name and the name of form groups it belongs to. In my case, I do not have any groups, so the path to the first name form control is an array of only one string called first name, and this path would be used to resolve eventually the control. If this control would belong to some additional form group, then I would have something like full name string that represents an appropriate form group and first name string that represents actually the form control instance. So once the control is resolved, then it is being set up. I won't be staying too long here, but in short, this is the place where validators are being set up. There happens writing the value to its value accessor, but we will talk more about that in a dedicated video. Once the control is set up, the form group does an initial update of the value and runs validators against it. And finally, it adds the directive instance to the array of all form control name directives within the form. And in the very end, it returns the control which was properly set up. When control is being removed, then happens obviously some opposite things. What else is worth to mention here? Yes, this directive handles some native form events like submit and reset. For instance, in submit handler, returning false from it happens preventing of default behavior for this event, namely page reloading, and also it emits ng submit event and the native one provided as an argument for the emitter. By the way, ng submit is just an Angular output. So that's why if we go to the browser and try to submit the form, you can see that the page isn't reloaded, which should happen by default, and everything is because form group directive prevents the default behavior. And here, as you can see, when the reset event happens, the reset form is called, which resets validation statuses and other statuses for each form control in the form. But about that, we will talk later in this course.